What do you and Ajamu have in common?
Our same enemies. No, I went to a funeral recently, and the guy, people kept saying over and over again, he was defined as much by his enemies as he was his friends. And I said to myself, that's a good person to be in company with, because you're clear.
You can find the file and I'm like,
It's true. Well, I got some gangster stuff to say today. So get ready. But my younger son, Guillermo, since I'm filling time, Guillermo says, Mom, all villains got a backstory. And I would just expand on that.
And most heroes have a heckler.
I would just like.
So what's Trump's backstory?
Huh?
So what's Trump's backstory?
Oh, I got 99 problems. Trump ain't one.
So, if I may interrupt, again, my name is Osantwa Nkrumah Toure. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace. I also work with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, where we organize a movement that is led, organized, and financed by poor people themselves and not foundations, the Democratic Party, or the nonprofit industrial complex. Feel me? All right. So, having said that, I want to make sure that everyone in this room signs our sign-in sheet. There's some literature over here on this table. It's going to have a sign-in sheet for the Black Alliance for Peace. There will also be a sign-in sheet for the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. All right? So, just wanted to say that, and hope you will sign up, and I hope you are active in an organization, because for a conference like this is where we do a lot of networking, but beyond the networking, we need to be organized, we need to make things happen, and we are the ones to do that. All right? Everybody feel me?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Asatawa, and please forgive us for us trying to get this thing together. I thought, because I don't have any technological skills, that I can just bring my computer and they'll plug it up and the PowerPoint will pop up. But we have to send it through email and all these kinds of changes. But while we do that, we will go ahead and start moving toward the workshop by a quick sort of intro to the workshop. Now,
There's still chairs over here if anybody wants to sit down.
Oh, okay. Thank you. This way, sorry.
Now, it's interesting because what came up already during the course of the conference was I think a very correct recognition that we have to figure out how we deal with this issue of human rights. We see that it's been used quite effectively by the enemy to confuse people, to provide a cover for reaction. And so what we want to do in this workshop is to suggest a framework that we can utilize that will separate us and what we define as human rights from the state. And we have, beyond this presentation that I'm going to provide, one of the persons that has been in the forefront of that redefinition, that expansion, that liberation, if you will, of the human rights framework. And that is my colleague and my friend, Cheri Honkala. Me and Cheri go back quite some time, and we do have common enemies. And some of those enemies are actually in the human rights field. But that's not a bad thing, though. Because what we have been trying to do is to, in fact, to decolonize that framework, to make it relevant to the working class and to poor people and to people who are concerned about imperialism, who see in the human rights ideal, if liberated, a radical framework, a framework that provides the moral and ethical foundation for advocating for and pushing for radical change, revolutionary change. So what we're going to talk about is this framework, what we call the people-centered human rights framework, a framework that has at its core the very simple idea that if there's going to be something we call human rights, it has to be defined by the people. It has to come out of concrete struggle. It has to be connected to and dedicated toward revolutionary change. And so we're going to briefly introduce some of the ideals. We'll compare the people-centered framework with the liberal traditional framework around the issue of war. Show the differences, and then we're going to talk about, with Cheri taking the lead, how this framework and this issue of war connect up to the very important and fundamental idea that people have certain inherent human rights. The right to housing, the right to health care, the right to a clean environment, the right to education, and how the thrust toward militarism and war undermines that, and what we got to do to correct that. So, where we are with that workshop, with that PowerPoint? Still working?
Seems like we're getting there.
Getting there, okay, all right. So, sharing, I think what we do, I think what we do then is just a,
Oh, hold on.
oh, close. Now, I have to say too, I'm so proud because
Thank you
What do I do?
so much.
I'll just press
Now
the
don't
arrows
go
on that.
anywhere.
because this is my first PowerPoint I've ever done by myself. See all that fancy stuff there? So, exactly. So we're gonna go through this. How can I stand over here? And we're gonna go through this quite quickly. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't want this to be too sort of, well, we'll go through it and see how it rolls out. Now, we have how much time?
You took louder.
To what time?
Hour and
Hour and a half, okay. Okay, so.
4:30.
4:30. I think maybe close to 4. We'll go through it and see what happens. So, as I was saying, we want to utilize this idea of human rights in a different way. We want this to be at the service of the people. And this quite famous comment, I think, captures that principle. That we can't talk about, or we can't utilize the liberal framework and expect for that framework to provide the tools for liberation. So we have to separate, we have to redevelop. Now, when we talk about the liberal framework, we're talking about a framework that is what we call state-centered, that comes out of the liberal tradition, the Eurocentric classical liberal tradition, that basically was a tradition that people want to believe was revolutionary, and I guess it was to a certain extent, because what it did, it provided a rationale for the emerging new liberal bourgeoisie. But it was limited in terms of how this liberal bourgeoisie saw the issue of rights. Who had rights? What people had rights that needed to be respected? And coming out of the Renaissance and then the liberal ascendancy, we had this notion that the only ones that had real rights, the only ones who were recognized as human beings, were basically people who were men, who owned property, and that they were the ones whose rights really meant something. So this was a limitation from the very beginning. We see that this was basically a convention. This notion of who was supposed to be a human, a man and a human, that came out of the European humanist tradition. And as we said, the definition of who is constituted as a human, male, Western, Christian, and they're the ones who could speak for all human beings. So this is very important to remember, this notion of who can speak for the human, okay? So from that moment, all the way up to the launching of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it was presumed that Europeans, European males, had the right to determine the range of accepted human rights. It was also assumed, too, that it was the state that had the responsibility, the authority to defend those human rights. And we see some of the issues with that state-centered perspective. And the most important principle here is this notion that the state-centered perspective legitimizes the state and undermines what should be the central principle of democracy, and that is that power resides with the people, okay? So, when it comes to issues of war, we want to very briefly look at how the liberal tradition looks at this issue of war. For the liberal tradition, their focus is on so-called armed conflicts. They recognize that wars result in tremendous death and suffering. They note that basically there is tremendous suffering, but they don't recognize certain forms of war like sanctions. We'll come back to that idea. This is a typical way in which they look at the issue of conflicts, armed conflicts. They recognize that they are both non-international armed conflicts along with international conflicts. But again, the focus is on armed conflicts. This is a focus that basically violations of international law during armed conflicts, regardless of who the perpetrator is where the abuse occurs. Now, so far you can already see that they don't take any position on war. They don't oppose war. They talk about the laws of war. And very briefly, this is the foundation of how they approach the issue of war. The main elements they use is so-called international humanitarian law, which is also known as the laws of war. And you can see the definition of what that means there, that this international humanitarian law is a set of rules codified in treaties or recognized through custom that limits the behavior of parties to a conflict. Very important. It demands, and this is important, that parties to an armed conflict distinguish between civilians who are afforded protection and combatants who are legitimate targets of attack. It says that civilians may not be deliberately targeted. Keep that in mind, okay? All parties to a conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects. We know what those are, buildings, schools, hospitals. And that serious violations of international human rights or international humanitarian law are war crimes. War crimes include also genocide and crimes against humanity. Now, that is connected to another distinctive area, international criminal law. International human rights law also comes into play. That is the body of law that includes customary international law, international human rights treaties, and other instruments, and confers legal form on inherent human rights. This is also applicable during the situations of armed conflict, meaning that when there is armed conflict, you still have to have an adherence to international human rights law. But with all of this emphasis on law, Western human rights groups oppose war. Do they oppose war or just want to proceed by agreed upon standards? We say that it's quite clear they don't oppose war, and as a matter of fact, they have done a tremendous amount of damage, because what they have created, primarily the human rights organizations, is this idea of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. This, we say, should have resulted in the moral collapse of the Western Human Rights Project. This was a project that was constructed by Western human rights groups working with states like Canada. Humanitarian intervention became a weapon of Western hegemony, selectively deployed in the furtherance of the agenda of the U.S., what we call in the Black Alliance for Peace, the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination. This humanitarian intervention gave perfect ideological cover and a justification for the U.S. becoming the global police persons of the world by providing a rationale for the assertion that the international community had a moral and legal responsibility to protect a threatened people. Mainstream human rights activists effectuated a shift in the discourse on the international human rights that moved the right to protect to beyond a term that was contested to something that became what we see as a common sense assumption, that the West has a right and indeed a responsibility to go and to save those peoples around the world who are being threatened by these bad dictators.
Savior complex.
This was what we referred to as the white saviors complex. The basis of it is the white man's burden, the white man's responsibility to bring civilization to the savages of the global South. And it's been very, very effective because it has confused people around, well, more in the U.S., in the West, than in the global South. Someone said that the consequence of this for U.S. policymakers and for the likely targets of U.S. aggression in the global South, did you read that? That radical said that. But it's been used as a very effective weapon to confuse the people and to provide a rationale for U.S. imperialism, and that's really key here. We contrast that with what we call the people-centered framework. This is a framework that says that what we define as human rights is an ongoing process. We recognize that there are these international treaties, that there are international human rights law, but it's state-centered, and we can use some of that. But we also understand that there are real limitations to that framework. And we say that because sovereignty resides with the people, it is the people in struggle who have the right and indeed the responsibility to determine the full range of what we define as human rights. And that's why we say it has to be a break of Eurocentrism and a understanding of what human rights should be from the perspective and the needs of oppressed groups and people. Some of the basic fundamental principles that separate this approach from the liberal tradition. That we say that it has to be a restructuring of social relations that perpetuate oppression and the acquiring of power on the part of the oppressed to bring about that restructuring. We say that opposed to this BS about being non-political and neutral, that the people-centered human rights framework takes a position. We stand with the oppressed. We are the oppressed. We are the downtrodden, okay? And that human rights has to be an instrument for us. We say that this project has identified all forms of oppression, oppressive relations, including capitalism, neoliberalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and imperialism as structural and ideological constraints on the ability to realize the full range of human rights. In other words, we define the enemy. We define the structures that undermine the ability of people individually and collectively to realize their human rights. This is the people-centered definition of human rights. Those non-oppressive rights. Now, what do we mean by non-oppressive rights? We all know that one of the central rights that the liberal tradition asserts is the right to property. That this is a right that should not be attacked by anybody. Well, for us, that is an oppressive right, and we don't recognize this fundamental right to property. So any assertion of a right that results in undermining the ability of others to exercise their rights, the majority, the oppressed, the working class, we don't recognize those as legitimate rights. The rights that we recognize are those that we define for ourselves. And we define those rights coming out of the objective needs and aspirations of the people. Rights that emerge as a consequence of struggle, of resistance. Okay? And we understand the whole notion of the individual and individual rights and collective rights. Okay? The liberal tradition only recognizes individual rights. Very quickly, people-centered rights assert the sovereignty of the people. We don't claim to be objective or neutral. And we, again, identify the objective of our struggle. The pan-European white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy that emerged in 1492. We name the enemy. Now, we say again that because of that, the people have a right and responsibility to protect against threats to international peace. Fundamental human rights and international law, when it's clear that a state or international order is unwilling or unable to provide that protection. We say that the action of the embassy protectors was a people-centered act to protect the international order.
Yeah.
Tell that to the judge.
So, I'm not going to go through this because this lays out, what states have in terms of their instruments or the weapons they could use. How many people heard of this concept of universal jurisdiction? Theoretically, it means that a state has a right to and a responsibility. Okay, all right. That a state has a right and a responsibility to prosecute individuals who have conducted war crimes and crimes against humanity, any place they may be. That was, you remember what happened with Pinochet, when he was charged by the Spanish courts. Okay, but they don't do that. But there is a recognition that universal jurisdiction exists. That's why a number of Bush officials are very careful about where they travel to, because there are a couple of European countries that said that they're going to detain and put on trial people like Rumsfeld also too. Okay. Well, what happens when states don't or can't act because they are engaged themselves in ongoing criminal activity? We say that falls, again, to the people. The actions that took place, again, at the Venezuela embassy. The protectors had a responsibility to protect international law. And that's, in fact, what they did. And what they were protecting against, what they were defending against, was the ongoing illegal coup that the Trump administration was engaged in. Now, they tried to impose this fiction within the context of the trial that because the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaido, that individual was in fact the president, even though the vast majority of the states on the planet recognized Maduro and the ongoing government in Venezuela. But we don't have to be, we don't have those constraints here. We have a right and indeed a responsibility to lay things out as we see it. We say that the human rights organizations are not anti-war, and just two quick examples. This is a statement from Amnesty International. Now read that statement and tell me that it doesn't appear like AI is in fact pushing for war. We go to Kenneth Roth, the director of Human Rights Watch. Some little BS language about human rights. But look what he says. Sometimes it requires military force. That's the basis of this whole humanitarian intervention. But yet they are neutral and objective. We say that unjust war is the ultimate violation of human rights. We say unjust war because we don't say that all war, well, some of us are anti-war and all of that, but anti-unjust war. That oppressed people have a right to do what they need to do to free themselves. We come back and we say that sanctions, we heard all that, so I won't go through that more here, that sanctions must be seen and projected out as a form of war. They are war. They result in massive human rights violations and the ultimate violation, which is death. And we say that these human rights organizations that don't take a stance against war are in fact immoral. So, the cost for the poor and working class in the imperialist state and in the state that is the target of the axis of domination is enormous. And we're not going to talk about that much more. What we're going to do now is move this over to Cheri, because, you know, it's been raised, how do we make the connection between global conflicts and the economic, social, he wasn't put like this, but the economic rights of people within the U.S. You know, what are the connections? Why is it that objectively, if you believe in human rights, you have to be anti-war or anti-imperialist? So we're going to ask Cheri to take up this part of the conversation. Thank you.
Cheri, if we may have a brief commercial break. I have sign-in sheets for the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. I also have sign-in sheets for Black Alliance for Peace. I'm going to pass this around, but I beg each and every one of you, please print clearly. I'm going to say it again. Please print clearly.
Thank you.
Repeat after me. Please print clearly. Thank you.
And would you start, Cheryl, with your website where probably we can get the presentation we just saw?
Oh, Ajamu?
Website where we can get the
BlackAllianceForPeace.org.
verbatim. What is it?
Verbatim. Are we going to be able to put that up? Is that up there yet?
We can.
Well, we can. That's a good idea. Yeah. Okay. That's Black Alliance for Peace. BlackAllianceForPeace.com.
Okay. And then you're gonna put. Okay. Okay, that's just to entertain you and keep you awake. Okay.
Sorry, we can't slow it down.
Oh my God, is that going fast?
Unless anyone else would like to try.
Okay, no, that's all right. That's the distraction. No. My name is Cheri Honkala, and I think I'm a storyteller. And I think the best way to tell you everything that I need to tell you in a short amount of time and make it entertaining so you don't fall asleep is to tell you a little bit about how we came to use a human rights framework. And then hopefully it'll all make sense to you, scare the hell out of you, and you'll come to an understanding of the importance of using a people-centered human rights model or live your lives. I've been poor my whole life, and by the way, I'm here with the bangingest group of people to work with. Galen back here in the corner here. So the journey takes us to literally building a U.S. version of a liberation army. I know some of you don't think we need it. Come live where we do. You need it. So when we began, I started this organization called the Kensington Welfare Rights Union, and we were broke-ass welfare recipients. I became the first loudmouth woman. That's never changed. And I threw myself on before Congress and said, you're not going to cut us off of welfare. I became the first welfare recipient in the country to testify and saying, you're nuts, we're going to die. We formed this organization, and we did the thing that a lot of poor people are taught at first, right? You spend all your resources, you take buses over and over again, and then you yell at the wall over and over again, and then the Democrats promise you they're going to make some changes, and then they never do, and then you go back and you do all of those kinds of things. So we are very practical. Somebody corrected me the other day. I said, we're pragmatic. They said, no, you're very practical. Where we had taken about 75 people to Harrisburg, our capital in Pennsylvania. And we were living on the Capitol, we were living inside. We walked every single day, 22 miles a day. Some people said, why did you guys walk? And everything we do is because we just don't have the money. We didn't do it as a symbolic thing. Hell, we would have taken some buses if somebody would have gave us a bus. And so we walked 22 miles a day and pushed baby strollers and did that kind of stuff. And then we got to Harrisburg. The moms were really excited because they got to use running water and wash up in the bathroom and that kind of stuff. And we set up sleeping bags and stuff like that in the Capitol Rotunda. And the janitors got to know us, and the janitors would come in and they say, oh, we're going to bring our kids. And they'd be like, well, there's homeless people. And our kids would be like, oh, there's janitors' kids. And when we were there, they ended up throwing us out. Not they did. Tom Ridge, who was the governor at the time in charge of Homeland Security. We got much worse people than him. And threw us out, and we began living on the Capitol stairs. And then the coldest day in October, at about 4 in the morning, the governor ordered the removal of the blankets. So the state troopers came and removed blankets from the women and the children. And we had to go down to Sheetz grocery store about 2 blocks down and beg them for plastic and cardboard to keep people from dying and getting hypothermia. Now that's how we came to use a human rights framework. It didn't come because we sat in a classroom. It didn't come from some books. It didn't come from, Amnesty International. Oh, boom! I threw a bomb. Okay, so it didn't come through that. And then we, began to, grow into our voice and that kind of stuff. And we didn't know about this other human rights thing going on in the world. And we didn't know that at some point we would become so effective that they would eat us alive and shit us back out. And that was a journey in itself too. So we got really excited. And there's this organization, I don't know, this Progressive Foundation. Oh, I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say it. There was this Progressive Foundation, Ford Foundation. Oh, I didn't say that. And they're like, oh, Cheri, we're going to put you on the cover of this magazine, and we're going to fly you all over the country, and you're going to talk to these different duty-free groups, and we're going to give you gajillions and gajillions of money, and you can talk about human rights all over the world and end human rights violations. And we, oh, God, that sounded so nice, didn't it? And so we didn't realize that there were other movements and our colleagues over the world that had already been eaten up and shitted out. And during this time, we were beginning to establish these relationships with other, peasant movements in other parts of the world. And they're like, Ford? They're like, they're doing some education with us in this way as well. But I'm trying to choose the important things. So then we didn't know this, but eventually I'm, giving sound bites to our very long, brutal history. This other big organization contacted us, Amnesty International, and said, we want to make this video about you guys. And so they made this video about us, and 80,000 copies went around the world talking about this group of poor people that have begun to encompass this new model domestically in the U.S. called economic, social, and cultural rights. So literally this video went around the world about us, right? Well, we're thinking, we're going to have a pot to piss in, finally. We're going to have something to, help our leaders around the country and that kind of stuff. And then we began to do what we thought was necessary for the growing of our movement, which is we began to grow across the country and teach people our model, teach people projects of survival and all of these kinds of things. And then the next thing we knew, we saw one of our former members on the cover of Reverend Liz Theo Harris, on the cover of magazines and publications and videos all across the entire country. And the next thing we knew is we learned this thing that we learned from unions, which is about raiding shops. And then we learned that, as we go closer and closer into an election period, and when you've got poor people talking about forming a poor people's army, as opposed to how do we fold into the Democratic Party, and when you're talking about independent politics, and when your road is not about taking the comfortable road, but is about giving a damn about the poor in Haiti, and every other part in the world is just as important as the people in Kensington, then they gotta take you out. So they began to take us out. My friend back here, his brother goes to jail for 7 years. They take Pastor here, and he's facing 20-some years. Many of us were just found guilty trying to stop the cuts to general assistance. Now I have over 200 arrests. At some point, you become in danger. So luckily there's an organization called Frontline who categorized me as one of 13 people doing human rights work in the US in most danger. And so what does that entitle me to? I get to go into exile in Ireland. Well, I don't want to go to Ireland. And we knew that the number one thing that happens, I'm sorry, this is very important that I say this. Freedom requires truth. So in order to smash freedom, you must smash truth. We are in a struggle for a voice and to be seen like never before. And as we learned, as we walked miles and miles and miles to meet with our Zapatista brothers and sisters in the middle of nowhere to have our private conversations, they said, damn it, those same progressive young people in your country, they need to rally around you folks and lift you up, because there's a conscious effort to make you guys disappear. So no longer did there was this progressive media thing, right? Especially around the Democratic National Conventions, the Republican National Conventions, right? Now they're passing out money to shut the hell up of groups that are talking about revolutionary changes in the world. And so, you know, some of those folks that they've tried to buy, right, that they've tried to buy have come, made their way back to us and said, listen, we were offered money to make you guys go away by using social media. And each of the progressive social media organizations are now being funded by that same Ford Foundation. So anyway, so fascists get us to disassociate with reality. And that's what we're watching. One of our members today, Jamal, didn't come. He's an African-American veteran. Yesterday, like in other major cities across this country, the same thing happens. But yesterday, another woman and her infant child were murdered. Unborn. Were murdered yesterday. We've had 300 kids. One of them, one of our soldiers that went to camp this last year, 10-year-old Samaj, shot. We've had more people now that have died than died in Vietnam. And we want to say, like Ajamu was talking about earlier, where's the anti-war movement? They're now 3 blocks from where I live, setting up a harm reduction center, the first in the entire country, so people can shoot dope. On the surface, that sounds like a really wonderful thing. Well, according to Dr. Sue, who is a doctor with Friends for Social Responsibility, Doctors for Social Responsibility, he says, is that really a harm reduction center? Then why don't they have that in a hospital? Mm-hmm. And what you're beginning to see is the absolute more people dying than ever before. You just open my door, and when I drive to go park at night, you have to drive and make sure you don't run into somebody that is passed out in the streets. Human beings shitting alongside the walls. We have an epidemic of hepatitis C. I got ordained online so that people could have access to somebody to bury somebody for free. And you know, I could just go on and on and on. The thing is we didn't declare this war, but it's a war. And like one of the police officers said to me, Cheri, I'm glad I'm getting ready to retire. I survived the Vietnam War, and I don't think I'm going to survive what's around here. And so somehow or another, we have shifted from this nonprofit industrial complex framework, and everybody keeps trying to put us back into it. We are organizing boot camps. We are teaching organization and discipline and military strategy, because that's what we're dealing with. We're in war.
That's right.
And don't belittle it. Don't talk about it. It's not bad. It's bad. And people are not surviving it. And it will not be on the cover of Time magazine. And it won't be on CNN. So, you know, and these are not just youth leaders. These both are women that are homeless right now. This is just normal. This is not a, you know, an exception. So anyway, so, you know, it was very important to me to talk about this as real as I could be real today, because this is how we need to reclaim the human rights framework in this country. We are casualties. You can't just teach, like, you know, the, you know, different letters of the alphabet. You know, there's people that do human rights work and drive Mercedes. And there's people that do human rights work and don't know how they're going to pay rent next month. Or living outside. Okay, so anyway, so the main thing I want to get across here is, you know, like that one day when the peasants in Chiapas said, we're forming a liberation army. We're not symbolic. We're forming a poor people's army, and we need you to take sides. This is not in no way, shape, or form about ego issues, although I'll admit I've always had ego issues. This is not about my attitude. Yes, I've always had an attitude.
For the right reason, though.
But I'm telling you this, we're on a different road. And it's not about this other human rights framework. We see ourselves as connected to the poor all over the world, and we give a damn about them being lifted up all over the world as much as we care about what's happening to us. There's just one last thing, I can't find it. So, okay, and the thing is it was very interesting because after my intern started this other organization, Reverend Liz Theo Harris, the key thing is that we are walking different roads. And for them, it was very easy to say that this is about other things and shouldn't we just all unite and fight? Hell no. If you taking the masses of other people off a fucking cliff, no, this ain't about unite the poor. Because, yes, so it's really important that we begin to pull back the curtain and we say, hello, how are you, and who are you funded by? I'm done.
Let me just add one small bit of information, really, really important. Now, we all use the human rights terms today, don't we? I mean, it's almost like kind of a common language, right? Wouldn't you say so? Now, some of us who've been around would tell you that 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. No one talked about, no one used that term, human rights, when it came to domestic policies and domestic realities. Well, how did that happen? It happened as a consequence of consistent struggle on the part of people like Cheri. And a matter of fact, I would say this, and we were trying to talk about how we could push out this real history because it's been co-opted and distorted.
We're gonna die for it. Oh,
Yeah,
I
that's
hope
right.
not.
That there was two organizations in the late 90s, the Poor People's Economic and Human Rights Campaign and the National Center for Human Rights Education, Loretta Ross. Cheri Honkala and Loretta Ross led, in my opinion, the struggle to popularize the human rights framework.
Yep.
Okay, that bus tour that you all did across the country, that was revolutionary because it was the first time that masses of people were exposed to the human rights idea, the human rights framework, the human rights language. That led to something we all were involved in too. That was the series of conferences led by Sister Dribble Hill, you know, the Southern Human Rights Organizers Conference, where many of the leading lights of the bourgeois human rights framework got their training. Okay? So these women were in the forefront of what we define today as the U.S. domestic human rights movement, and they need to be lifted up for that.
He's leaving out all the ugly parts.
We want to talk about the Human Rights Network. All right, so let's open up for comments, questions.
You got 25 minutes.
Yeah, 25 minutes. Okay.
Ask some
Please keep
juicy
your
ones.
question, comment brief. Brief.
I thought it was over at 4:30.
The program says 4.
Oh, yeah, well, you said 4:30.
Ask some juicy questions.
Yeah. So we have to be out here at 4 o'clock, all right?
Where's the thing to sign?
Okay.
Sign it, she's right
Go
here.
ahead.
You haven't gone around?
Still it?
Somebody went around.
Oh, I signed it.
Your group is very impressive.
It didn't go around
Got
this
a
way.
master's in ethics at Union Theological, and I know exactly the disgusting, like, nonprofit industrial complex you're talking about. So really appreciate you speaking truth to power, and that. What is your biggest need? How do we help?
At Union Theological Seminary.
With an honorarium. With an honorarium.
Yeah.
So let me repeat that.
No,
With an honorarium.
they teach a class on this woman called Cheri Honkala at the Union Theological Seminary. I've never been invited.
Wow. Yep. I will stand outside of you. Yes.
The Poor People's Campaign is a former intern of all of ours.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, they big her up all the time.
Huh?
They big her up all the time, but I know what you mean about the nonprofit industrial complex I worked at.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it's gonna come out. It's, you know, it's kind of like, you know, those days when, you know, Martin and Malcolm, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, anyway, so, that, how do I want to say? No, I don't want to say.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Come on.
Yeah, it'll come back. It hasn't come to me. But I look at Galen and he knows.
But she asked, what do you need?
I mean,
We don't just need a speaking engagement.
no. I mean, we need net war. We need to,
Explain that.
every journalist, everybody that does social media, you name it, we have to go, we are in a fight to have the masses of people actually hear from poor people right now, not from the two reverends.
Right. That's right.
That's what we need right now. And one is, I'm sure Reverend Barber's a great guy. Liz Theo Harris, I'm a Rev now too, online. And let me tell you this, and you are my intern, and you never had a day where you worried about a gallon of milk. But anyway, and so, no, that's what I was gonna say. I can't go into details because I love my life. But a group of them got together with me, literally took me in a room and threatened that if I continued to talk the truth, that there will be consequences. So I'm just saying, it's really, yeah, I know that'll blow your mind.
Ford people or union people?
Huh?
Ford people or union?
Oh, they're Ford and
Liz?
Union.
Oh, okay.
They all together now.
They're married.
So
Almost incestuous.
the former,
But she's not making a specific allegation against
Right.
anyone.
yeah, the former. Okay, so the short story is that somebody at the Ford Foundation basically said, you guys stop dealing with Gaza and do not have anything to do with economic, social, and cultural rights. Otherwise, we're going to take this money and we're going to start a different organization. So they got rid of this guy called Roger Norman. They took the money away from that human rights organization and they started a new human rights organization. Like overnight, guys. And then they said, Cheri, do not mess with the Labor Party because we cannot have independent politics in this process. We said, you ain't gonna tell us what we're gonna do. They said, okay, guess what? We're gonna take this money. We're gonna form this organization. It's great stuff.
It really is.
Yeah, well, all that money.
So, and if you want to look, there's a document called Bringing It Home. And it's written by the Ford Foundation. And if you look at that, it's all about us.
That's the one of bringing human rights home.
Bringing Human Rights Home. Has all of our kids and,
Is that the one where I'm in it?
yeah, you're in it.
Everybody's in it.
Yeah, hand here.
Next question.
You know, I've had this aha. I used to work at the Alameda County Food Bank, which was in Oakland. And every May, we'd take a load of moms and people that depended on the food bank for food, that had stories, real life stories, what was going on for them. And probably were active in the area or something, because one year we get up there, we're out in front of the steps, and people are in wheelchairs and crutches and people are not healthy. And there must have been 50 or 60 highway patrol that circled us shoulder to shoulder. And we were all going, what? I mean, this is the, Alameda County Food Bank, what's going on? So we knew that there was something that had to be connected and to getting people's voices out. And it was frightening. Nothing like what you've been through, but it was frightening. And we got back on our buses and left, and that was the end of that one. But
It's a really important, powerful thing.
Yeah, the person in the striped shirt, Ajamu.
Could I go here and then here? Okay.
What's behind, or who or what is behind all of the laws that criminalize the homeless and the feeding of hungry people that say you can't sleep in your cars, that do these things that make those people who are poor, turn them into criminals.
Well, I think it's no different than what Glenn Ford talked about earlier, right? Or I can't remember the woman's name, but if you take, what was the word that she used?
Are you talking about Susanna Deli, the human rights lawyer?
I think maybe, yeah. No, the woman from Korea. Yeah, she said they're afraid that people will go nuclear. Well, you know what? They're afraid we're going to go nuclear, and if we don't implement, if they don't implement the solution, I think, quite frankly, we're a homeland security issue. So we might as well say it out loud. You can't take gajillions of dollars away from the only way to feed, clothe, and house us and just think we're just gonna die. You have to, I mean, we have, you know, I'm trying to work on this game that's called What Does Fascism Look Like? Because I think that people have these these fake ideas of like that was just like a different period in history and this is what it looked like and da 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 da. It's removed from today. And I think that we have to break it down for people. That when you have a mobile jail and you don't have to go through due process anymore and you can just shoot people, you can stack them up in the back of the paddy wagon, you can call them drug addicts, right? Because you live near the harm reduction center and everybody's on opiates, right? You can take away kids, you can fast track them into adoption. You know, African Americans have been living in cages for a long time before people start talking about the border.
That's right, that's right, that's right.
And so I think that, you know, it's just really, I think it's no different than, you know, before you go to war, you have to dehumanize sections of the population and justify your behavior. And so that's what they're doing right now.
Exactly. If I could make a quick comment on that too before we go to the next one.
Mr. Ajamu.
I think it's important to note that legally it is local authorities that have the right to pass an ordinance that determines where you can feed and where people can sleep. But it's important to understand why that has been happening. And you connect that to what's been going on for the last 2 decades with these cities becoming neoliberal sites of contention. That basically these cities, most of them under the control of the Democrats, most of them under the control of black Democrats that have basically decided that various parts of the city are going to be turned over to capital. And when that happens, it means you've got to get rid of the people who are there. And so you have objectively the criminalization of poverty. This has been happening across the country. So we say that, number one. Secondly, you know, one of the things that the work of Cheri and the campaign was able to do was to, again, make people aware of the fact that we have something called economic human rights. And those rights consist of the right to housing, and the right to education, and the right to health care. But then the question becomes, why aren't we able to realize those human rights? Well, because we don't have a state that's committed to human rights. That the government or the state is supposed to be the entity responsible for recognizing and protecting and fulfilling our objective human rights that we all have theoretically as individuals and as collectivities. But they don't do that because their interest is to serve capital. Okay? How do we then connect that to the issue of war and militarism? Well, 2 things. Cheri just talked about the fact that because of the economic dislocation taking place across the country, and the reality of people's lives, people are in motion, they're in resistance. And the state understands that in order to contain and control us, you have to have the instrument of control. And the major instrument of control is what? The domestic army that we refer to as the police.
And education.
So the national security state has been strengthened to deal with the contradictions of capital, to deal with the fact that they have not been able to or been unwilling for us to fulfill our objective of human rights. That's part of the war that's being waged against the working class and poor in this country. Second quick point. That's why this issue of militarism and the budget is so vitally important. Sarah Flounds has talked about the fact that 10% of the U.S. military budget, if that was transferred to addressing the objective human rights needs of the people, we can do away with homelessness. We can do away with the fact that people are that almost 70,000 people are dying every year in this country because of inadequate health care.
Those are crimes against humanity.
These are crimes against humanity. It could be, we can wipe out global poverty with a third of the U.S. military budget, but it's not happening. So we've got to make those political points, those ideological points. We've got to show people that if you believe in human rights, if you believe in the inherent dignity of all of us, we've got to fight against capital. Because as long as they're in power, we're not going to be able to realize our objective human rights. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming and thank you for this program, speaking today. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you know, I'm from Ann from Brooklyn. We're organizing some support locally to support for public housing tenants and privatizing in New York City. Doing it very slick with excuses and, you know, kind of low key, a little bit here, a little bit there, etc. And food stamps. Do y'all have any suggestions of how to organize to support, stop the cuts of food stamps in April? And
we'll give you we'll get your number and we'll give you a whole lot of ideas. And to use a human rights framework. I mean, some of these bastards got to be, you know, charged with, you know, crimes against humanity. We've got to, yeah, I mean, people are, especially around this issue of this issue of the drug war, right? I mean, they're wiping people off the planet Earth, and yeah, I could just go into it forever. You know, giving billions of dollars at the same time as they're like killing all these people and taking away all their children. I mean, something has to happen. But in terms of housing issues, we'll get your number and we'll talk to you. But a little plug for myself. I was found guilty. We took over housing and urban development because we had the audacity to want to talk to somebody there about cutting 100,000 people from public housing. And we had the audacity to talk about the devastation in Puerto Rico with housing. And so I was found guilty of a misdemeanor, and it's in the process of being appealed. So that just has to stay on top.
Thank you. I think it's important to point out that you know, they cut food stamps or cut federal housing, that austerity is a bipartisan project. And despite people claiming to be opposed to Trump, they gave him everything he wanted, including his military budget, including a space force. Liberals snickered about a space force, and the Democrats went and just gave it to Trump. So I just wanted to say that. That's a reminder.
Sandra?
Oh, let him go, because he's been holding his hand up.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation. I want to make sure that we connected the work that y'all are doing with our work internationally also on human rights. We've been pushing, you mentioned the drug war, the Philippines, the current president has waged a war on drugs in these last few years, and it's killed over 30,000 people. We've appealed at every level in the Philippines and internationally on cutting aid, like the billions that could go to people's needs here, also going to the Philippine police and military in Philippines that's killing our people. We've appealed to it at every level, but what I would appreciate is that we are also pushing this idea of collective people's rights beyond just your individual human rights. So we've had a conference on people's rights, the indigenous people, national minorities in the Philippines. And so I just want to hear about how y'all have connected maybe with other international movements. You mentioned Chiapas. We can get together with, you know, your work here in the Philippines around advancing a people-centered collective human rights agenda, and where y'all have seen maybe some success around that, or what bodies that y'all have pushed some of that forward. Yeah.
Well, we have both been very much involved in the international scene, but go ahead, you start, and then I'll talk.
Right. I mean, we were both sort of instrumental in developing the first ever network, a human rights network that was explicitly committed to holding the U.S. accountable to human rights violations, both in the U.S. and abroad. And that is the U.S. Human Rights Network. In doing that, we were engaged in international advocacy, going to Geneva, going to New York, all of that. Those things can be important. But the real key is building bases, connecting up with other organizations across the globe involved in this work, and developing the international networks. Because what did we talk about? We talked about the limitations of the state-centered approach to human rights. That basically you can go and you can appeal, you can sit down with these folks until you know, so-called blue in the face. We don't get blue. But, you know, nothing happens. In fact, the petty bourgeois human rights organizations, they get off on that kind of stuff.
Hello.
And so they go to Geneva. Exactly. And they meet and they write up some stuff and make it seem like they making real progress. It's all BS. If you're not building movement to shift power from these criminals to the people, then basically just bullshit. Okay, so we say that if human rights are going to have any kind of value to the oppressed, they've got to be revolutionary, which means building these people-centered connections.
Let's get radical people.
Ms. Sandra.
Okay, so
we can't hear you.
I was gonna say, what we just saw on the presentation about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and that's this system. That's the system that we live in, and how we have as people a choice, not even a choice, but we have to dictate what we want in our lives. When it comes to what our definition of cost of life is, you know what I mean? And our definition of, what we see, the dismantling of this system, and how, how we can prepare for it, and, just straight up solutions. Because we cannot just manage a problem, because that's what we've been doing for generations. So it's our turn to actually solve these issues, and if that means literally having this system fall apart, that's what's gonna happen. But we just have to be ready for what that looks like and be prepared for it. I mean, poor people in this country are prime example. We live in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, and there are people that are, I'm 23, housing is unaffordable. I don't have generational wealth. Wealth was not handed to me. So that being said, it's like we have to start thinking in terms of future generations of us, and just like Martin Luther King and what we're doing, following in his footsteps, along with many other revolutionary people, and what we see what revolutionaries look like today. Those are the examples that we have to follow.
The young lady in the back.
Why, thank you. And I know Netfa wants to talk to you. I just have a really quick comment to follow up on what Margaret Kimberly raised about the Space Force, because we didn't actually organize anything at this anti-war conference around the Space Force. But on our podcast, Clearing the Fog, we interviewed Bruce Gagnon of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. And he's been doing this since 1982. They're planning, so that the Space Force is going to be literally like leaps and bounds beyond any type of military spending that we have ever seen in this country. We think it's bad now, but with the Space Force, it's going to be outrageous, and they're planning on funding it by further cuts to social programs. Surprise, surprise. So this is something that we need to be aware of in our organizing, because it's just happening. It just was in the NDAA in December. They just made the first general of the U.S. Space Force, and now he's on the National Security Council. So we need to also be connecting our struggles to that, bringing that into our discussions as well.
If I can, and I think, we're going to go a few more minutes. Yeah, okay. Before we go to the next couple of questions, so lay that out. I want to go back to this very, very important comment made by the sister here. That, you know, in 2020 going forward, it's going to be vitally important that we talk about the absolute necessity for system change. We've got to be even more explicit, though. We've got to talk about capitalism.
Yes.
We've got to talk about imperialism. We've got to take those terms back and define them and be prepared in our organizing work to do that.
That might impact my job.
Because we can't afford any more confusion, okay? And the people are demanding that.
Yeah.
They're demanding clarity. So we want to be as explicit as possible. And don't accept any bullshit about the people don't understand these kind of terms.
Hello.
That comes primarily from petty bourgeois organizers who don't understand it themselves. So, you know, we've got to be talking about the absolute necessity for building a revolutionary movement.
That's right.
That is the core value that we operate from as revolutionaries. So it is about the future. It is about the kids and the grandkids. It's about what we do today to ensure that they have a future, understanding that they can't have a future as long as we have the continuation of this backward system. Okay? No confusion around that. And that's why using the human rights framework, the people-centered human rights framework, is important, because we're talking about ultimately also too a clash of values. They are going to say, and you're going to see this even more in the next couple of weeks, that any idea of socialism is abnormal because it doesn't correspond to our human nature. They're going to tell us that basically, you know, if you're talking about socialism, that you're talking about something that it requires oppression, because you're talking about undermining rights, those non-oppressive rights we talk about. We say we reject the notion that we can't advocate for and move toward really doing, taking over the fossil fuel industry. We don't need to be begging them. Take them. We're concerned about the cost of health care. When you eliminate the health care costs, if the hospital chains and the pharmaceutical companies are controlled by the public, okay? So these kinds of policies represent the foundation for a real socialist transition, and we've got to be talking about stuff like that, in my opinion.
And I just want to throw in, because I always forget, and then people look at me like, Cheri, how come you forgot that? But anyway, so I think one of the things that's a little different about how, or a people-centered way, is that we're serious when we say that eating, sleeping, and surviving is not up for negotiations. And it's not enough to just say those things. So that's why, even though this other campaign is stealing everything that we say, we have built this new underground railroad. And for about 30 years now, we've been teaching people how to reclaim abandoned houses and move families in there. You'll never hear about us, but we've been teaching it and doing it for 30 years. And as well as reclaiming land. Yes, sometimes the city comes and digs it all up in the middle of the night. But or we set up encampments or whatever. But, you know, we have a, you cannot build a poor people's army for liberation if people can't eat and don't have a place to sleep. So we are not this charity model. We are not this liberal do-gooders model. We're like any other generals in an army. We're trying to figure out how to feed, clothe, and house our troops in order to create the kind of generals in order to reclaim, or not even reclaim, because several of us will say that we've never had any of our rights. But in order to, you know, take back or, you know, have, oh, where's our Langston Hughes when we need it? Okay, but Pastor, but, you know, they've got Reverend Barber. We got Pastor Cullins.
Yeah.
And this man has been in the forefront of every controversial, you know, mass incarceration, you know, especially in Pennsylvania, Mumia. It's no accident that he's facing serious legal charges. And so I encourage you, if you need a pastor, go with the one that's free.
I know that's right.
But Pastor wanted to say something. He's got his hand up too.
Well, down, say something.
Okay, go ahead.
You like me? No, I just want to say, as Brother Ajamu said, and Cheri, you know, we have to actually liberate the food supply. No, I'm a part of a food network, and I went to this warehouse this past week. This first time I went to this one, right? Bigger than this building. And I had a young man with me, Kwame. And I said, Kwame, look, I said, can you look at this estate? Just look at this. All this, but you have to, they dole it out. I said, why the hell don't they take out the middleman, let people come in here, put a sign, come get your food. Then Wawa, I don't know if y'all have Wawa here in New York, but where we Wawa, we pick up at this other upscale white church, the evangelical church, like 15 bags of Wawa sandwiches, this, that, other. And I said, why don't they just have a damn aisle where they say, because they're going to throw it in the trash. Have an aisle in the store. We have to command that stuff to happen. To take out, because we can only pick it. Sometimes I can't even get there because I don't have money to get a van. I don't have money to rent a van. I don't have money to rent a SUV. So I have to take cars. So we're limited. But we have the power to do that, to approach Dietz and Watson. I don't drive Dietz and Watson. They said they got millions of pounds of food that they have to give away. So there should be no food shortage in this country. They're pushing food into the ocean. So it's up to us, the real human rights activists, to say, no, cut the middleman out, cut out this other stuff.
Liberate the food.
Supermarkets throw away 25% of their food. They throw it away. So why don't they have 2 or 3 free? Now the people that want to pay, the people that's making $100K, go ahead and pay for your food. But the people that they need some free food, it's 3 hours of free food. Get what you want and have your dignity going back. That's up to us to carry that.
My question is more about this connections, these people connections that y'all are making, and the like all these barriers to connections between people that poverty causes, that being poor causes. Like, I'm thinking about friends, you know, I've known who their parents will put them out of the house, you know, because they don't have enough food to eat, or because, you know, it's like, oh, the new man that I got needs my attention. It causes, you know, strife in relationships between parents and their children. You know, it causes strife in, you know, our town doesn't have any jobs, so yes, we'll take a prison because it'll get us some more jobs. You know, that kind of, and that comes down as well to, like, people talk about it as gender and misogyny and racism, you know, sometimes through a petty bourgeois framework. But I'm more wondering about, like, how do you all create generals who won't put their kids out? You know, how do you all, like, go to that kind of stuff to create an army that won't compete against itself, so they can really do some of that uniting work?
That's one of the. That's one of the. One second. That's one of the best things. That's one of the best secrets we got.
Yes.
That's one of the best secrets. We have what's called the principles of unity, and we fist fought each other. For the unity around those principles of unity.
And I just happen to have a copy.
Oh, and she just happens to have a copy. But
And we're also multi-generational, multicultural, or, you know, group of people. So it's not just one person's or one group of people's perspectives. We are open to all of our perspectives. Right. We all live different lives, right, you know, or different variations of the same life, right, you know, so it's just our perceptions of what we live through. But we come together and, you know, actually do some critical thinking, right, you know, this country doesn't let you do that. And especially education is number one when it comes to poor and impoverished people. Right. The state, government, whatever you want to call it, they have systematically made it so that people don't understand most of the things that we're talking about. But at the same time, if we were to explain it to them in a way that they can understand, they would understand it because they live in it every day.
Exactly. And we know that, oh, were you saying something? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
We do boot camps. I don't know if you was listening in the beginning. My fault. I don't know if you was listening in the beginning, but you know, we do boot camps, we do education, we run them on a daily basis, you know what I'm saying? We deal with crisis on a daily basis. So this is not something that we just put in the side. Like, we invite everyone in for everyone's opinion, and we get down to it. And we become radical, and we become like to the point where we making the other parties live it. Because we don't care. We want to be heard.
Can I answer your other question about how you said, how do you create generals and how do you create, you know, an army? I would say, you know, it has to do with, you know, at home, you know, your family unit. Not only that, you know, because my mom was a single mother. So, and she raised me in this. It's not something that I just like, oh my God, I woke up one day and I'm like, oh my God, I have to fight for poverty. No, I lived in it. Right. I live it every day. Right. So it's not even about how we can connect, because we're all connected. Mm-hmm. It's just how we can, you know, not only explain it to other people, but how can other people feel like they're a part of something that they've never, you know, they've never thought of, you know, or they've never felt it, you know? So it's like, all right, we're not only trying to just collect the poor and have poor, you know, we have allies. Allies are very important, especially, you know, back in the day during slave times. Like, this is critical, and that's how we're thinking now. Like, this is literally a war, and these are human lives that we're losing. So it's like we have to literally think strategically. We have to, you know, create our own resources, because the resources that are there are not given to us. So we got to take it back, and that's the difference.
And I think that the fact that we travel like wolves, we don't ever go anywhere alone, and it's really because we respect the enemy, and we know that we're expendable. If we're not exploitable, we're expendable, and so we want to know that every second of every moment we're creating new generals through whatever conference or whatever kind of learning experiences, because when the big guys say it's time for you to go away, we've, you know, planted the seeds all across the country.
And this is why it's important that we choose lives over luxury.
Yes. Bam!
That's just it.
And
we're having a march. We're having a march around the Democrat National Convention July 13th in Milwaukee at 4 p.m. opening day. Did you want me to share something else, Ms. Cheri?
Yeah,
what that means?
What we like, when we about ready to close out, right?
Okay.
And we wanted to ask if you would bless us with a poem.
Oh, I was about to say, get it out there now. Don't play around with it. Don't play. You talking to Tot today? Now, don't play. You gotta speak up. Just saying. This poem is called "Let America Be America Again" by Langston Hughes.
Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America was never America to me. Let America be the dreamer's dream. Let it be that great strong land of life with love, with never kings connive nor tyrant scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic grief, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draw your veil across the stars? I am the poor, white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding the only same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying needs. I am the work, I'm work the men, of take the pay. Ooh, hold up. Hold up, y'all caught me.
We got you, baby, we got you.
It's cool, I always drink aqua though. Hold on, my fault. I am the young man, full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying needs, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything's for one owns greed. I am the farming, bondsman to the soil. I am the workers, sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream, beaten yet today. Oh, pioneers, I am the man who never got ahead, the poorest workers bartered through the years, yet I am the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world while still surfing kings who dreamt the dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet is mighty endearing scenes in every brick and stone and every furrowed tone that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I am the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I'm the one who left dark island shore and Poland's England's grassy lay and torn from black Africa strands. I came to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me, surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung. The millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again. Let that land, the land that had never been, yet must be. The land where every man is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, England, Indians, Negroes, me. Who made America? Whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. For those who live like leeches on people's lives, we must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America has never been America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America it will be. Out of the rank and ruin for our gangsters' death, the rape of the rot, the graft, the stuff, the lies, we, the people, must redeem. The land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All of these struts of these great green states and make America again.